So thank you all for this session as part of our ongoing webinar series for the 2020 Old Line State Summit, and thank you to our speakers for being with us this session. My name is Jessica Feltz, and I am the Preservation Initiatives Manager at Preservation Maryland. More information on our upcoming sessions as well as recordings of past sessions can be found at oldlinestate.org. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for their support of this program, Whiting Turner, the Maryland Historical Trust, Worcester Eisenbrandt, Brennan & Company, and the Mittendorf Foundation. Our sponsors, along with support from members and donors, make it possible to present these sessions free of charge, and we greatly appreciate it. Today's session is The New Frontier, Preservation on the Moon. We will first hear from Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony, a historian of science and technology and curator of the Apollo collection at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. She is the author of Apollo to the Moon, A History in 50 Objects, and Operation Moonglow, A Political History of Project Apollo, which will be released this fall. She was the historical advisor for a 6-part television series on Project Apollo, and her work has been featured by BBC, CBS, CNN, NBC, NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, among other outlets. Then we will hear from Michelle Hanlon. She is co-director of the Air and Space Law Program at the University of Mississippi School of Law and its Center for Air and Space Law, and is co-founder and president of For All Moonkind, Inc. For All Moonkind is a nonprofit that is the only organization in the world focused on protecting human cultural heritage in outer space. It has been recognized by the United Nations as a permanent observer to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Michelle chairs the International Committee of the National Space Society. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be with you all on the 51st anniversary of the first moon landing and share with you the story of lunar exploration and what we can do to preserve those sites. I'm going to turn my camera off for the presentation. All right. So to start, I'll give you a brief overview of Project Apollo. So going back to the 1960s. All right, so to begin, Kennedy's decision to send humans to the moon. So Kennedy became president in January of 1961, and then shortly after that, the Soviet Union was able to launch and successfully fly Yuri Gagarin in space. And so this was the first human spaceflight, and it was seen as a huge blow to US prestige and another sign that the US was trailing the Soviet Union in space exploration. And that had already been established with the launch of Sputnik in 1957, and that was the first satellite. So this was a big blow to US prestige. And then shortly on the heels of that, a few days later, the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba was another disaster. It was a failure, and it was another blow to US prestige. And so Kennedy asked his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, to find him a space program that we could win. Johnson consulted with a number of experts and eventually suggested to Kennedy, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble moving this forward. Okay, Project Apollo. So the goal of Project Apollo sounds relatively straightforward. So it's send humans to the moon, land them there, and then bring them safely back to Earth before the end of the decade. But the task ranks among the most bold and challenging in history. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is from the very start, Project Apollo was designed to engage people around the world. And so you can see a quote from this speech that Kennedy gave at a joint session of Congress when he first proposed Project Apollo in May 1961. And he said, "If we are to win the battle that is going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space have made it clear to us as the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take." And so I wanted to share this part of the speech with you because it really emphasizes this point that Kennedy and his advisors and many political leaders at that moment in time thought that space exploration would be very influential to larger geopolitical alignment within the midst of the Cold War. And so efforts were taken throughout the 1960s to engage the world public in space exploration. And you can really see that clearly in a lot of the symbolic activities of the first lunar landing. So as I mentioned, it was a very, very bold task. So sending humans to the moon, they have to travel roughly 240,000 miles. The cost of the program at the time was $25 billion. This was the most expensive civilian technological program in history. By the mid-1960s, the workforce was over 400,000 people, and they had to develop new capabilities like spacewalks and docking and rendezvous and long-duration spaceflight. When Kennedy proposed Project Apollo, the US had a total of 15 minutes of experience in spaceflight, so a brief suborbital flight for human spaceflight. So it was a huge challenge to commit the country to. I apologize that it's slow to move these slides forward. So this is just a brief overview of Project Apollo from 1961 to 1972. There were 11 crewed missions. 4 of these missions tested equipment, 6 were lunar landing missions, and there was 1 aborted mission, Apollo 13. One thing that I think is important to point out here, especially for our discussion today, is that no human has been more than 400 miles from Earth since 1972. So this is a drawing of the Apollo spacecraft as well as the Saturn V rocket. So the Saturn V rocket is a 3-stage rocket, and I wanted to share this with you because I'll be showing some more detailed pictures where this becomes relevant. But inside this spacecraft, you can see it's a multi-part spacecraft. At the very top, you can notice astronauts dressed in blue, and they're sitting inside the command module. Below them is the service module with and then below that is the lunar module, which is the spacecraft they took to the moon. And that's a 2-part spacecraft. And so this is a picture of the lunar module, and that's why I wanted to show you that last picture. And this is where some of the story of the important symbolic activities and things that were left on the moon took place. And so as you can see, the astronaut is going down the ladder. On that ladder, and you can look to your right, is a plaque. And this plaque was designed with the input of many people. So a number of months before the lunar landing, the NASA administrator created the Symbolic Activities Committee, and they consulted with people from the State Department, the U.S. Information Agency, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, and the White House to create a number of symbolic activities and items to be left on the moon. And this is one of the important ones here. And I'll show you. This makes it a bit more easy to read. And what really comes through with this item, this plaque that was left on the descent stage of the lunar module, is that the message that the United States wanted to convey through the first lunar landing was that that this was a global endeavor, that it was for all mankind. Today we'd say for all humankind. But it was very, very carefully constructed, and you can see that the depiction of the Earth doesn't show any political boundaries, and that's very intentional. And the idea was that this was supposed to communicate and signal that this was an accomplishment of human civilization, not just the United States. In addition to the plaque, there were a number of other items that were left on the moon. There's the silicon disk that you can see here over on the left, and NASA and the State Department invited foreign leaders to create messages to be left on the moon. Then those were shrunken down and etched onto this disk. It's about the size of a 50-cent piece. In the center there is an olive branch. This is in its gold, and this was left on the moon as well, and it's supposed to be a symbol of peace to reemphasize a message of Apollo that it was a peaceful mission for all humankind. And then they also left items from astronauts and cosmonauts who had perished. And this is a patch from the Apollo 1 mission, which was a lost mission. And then there were also medals from 2 cosmonauts who had passed away. And this was an effort to include the Soviet Union within this American accomplishment. Another thing that they decided to do was bring the flags of countries from around the world, miniature flags, to the moon. And then they brought them back to Earth and gave them as gifts to foreign leaders with pieces of moon rock. And you can see they're very small, about the size of grains of rice in lucite. And then after the last Apollo mission, they actually did a very similar thing where they had another set of plaques given to foreign leaders around the world. One of the things that was heavily debated ahead of the lunar landing was whether or not the United States should plant an American flag on the moon, and it became quite controversial. So the State Department worried that it could spark international controversy because it would suggest that the United States was claiming moon as its territory, and there was a lot of concern with that. And some members of Congress agreed and pushed back and suggested that the United States do something else, like leave a silver globe to counteract the symbolic impact of the American flags on the spacesuits and the spacecraft, and suggested they plant a UN flag instead. But ultimately, the majority of Congress pushed for including the flag because US taxpayers had funded the project. And once NASA announced that it would raise an American flag on the moon, the House of Representatives approved NASA's appropriation bill after amending a provision with a statement that the flag of the US and no other flag should be implanted on the surface of the moon. And here you can see, this is Jack Kinsler, who was responsible for designing a special telescoping rod for mounting this, for raising this moon, this flag on the moon. And you can see there's the sort of practice lunar module there, and he demonstrates how to unfurl that flag. And each of the Apollo missions planted an American flag on the moon, although now solar radiation has stripped them of their colors, and I believe they're just white flags now. They're no longer the stars and stripes. So another important part of the symbolism of Apollo comes through with the mission emblem that you can see here. So this was designed by the crew. It wasn't designed by the Symbolic Activities Committee, but it signals a very similar type of message. And what the crew decided to do is they left their names off of the patch. Traditionally, the names of the crew would be on the patch. They decided to leave them off because they wanted to be inclusive, and that this mission represented the hundreds of thousands of people that had worked on Apollo, as well as all humankind. They chose the eagle, which is the national bird, but they put an olive branch in its talons, which represents peace. So that's another signal that this was a peaceful mission for all humankind. In the middle there, you can see the bird that they used to draw this image. This is from a National Geographic book about birds. And then you can see on the spacesuit, the patch sort of up on the chest. And you see this patch many other places as well. So also ahead of the mission, in addition to the training and the planning and the symbolic activities and everything else that went into it, the U.S. Information Agency, which was the United States international public relations agency of the day, in addition to the State Department, made sure that there would be a foreign audience for the lunar landing. And they did that a number of ways. So they created the largest ever public relations campaign in history. They had radio and film documentaries playing around the world, and they had these exhibits that you can see, including spacecraft tours, as you can see in the middle there. They distributed books and pamphlets and posters. They worked with local television stations, and they handed out buttons and all sorts of things to really get people excited and aware that the lunar landing was coming in July 1969. So Apollo 11 launched on July 16th, 1969 at 9:32 a.m. from Florida, and it captured a global audience from the very start. And you can see a picture here of people watching in South Korea. In many places, massive screens were set up outside, and so people could follow every stage of the mission. And this is one of the examples of that. And then the astronauts landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. The landing happened about 4:17 p.m. East Coast time, and you can see the lunar module here. A number of hours later, about 10:30, Neil Armstrong, they vented the oxygen from the lunar module into space, and then he moved his way. He started to move his way down the ladder, but before he did, he pulled a lever that released an equipment stowage tray, which lowered a drawbridge and started a television camera filming. And this television coverage was transmitted to Earth, and that's a really important part of the Apollo story. So over 500 million people were able to watch the first steps on the moon live. This was unprecedented. It was a global audience, a truly global audience for the first time in history, and half the world's population followed the flight through the combination of television and radio and newspaper coverage. So it was an important unifying event. President Nixon called them from the Oval Office, and you can see that in this picture here. And he congratulated them, and one of the things he did was emphasize how they brought the world together. He said, for one priceless moment, the Earth is truly one. So he reemphasized this point that it was something that involved everyone around the world, and that it was a human endeavor beyond just an American accomplishment. And here you can see audiences from around the world following the flight, from Norway and Japan and Ecuador. After the mission, the Apollo 11 crew traveled the world. This was a diplomatic tour that was in part in support of the Nixon administration and its policies, and it reemphasized this message that Project Apollo and space exploration was for all humankind. And what impressed upon the astronauts is that everywhere they went, people would say to them, "We did it." So there's a sense of shared accomplishment in the mission that really struck them. So this is a slide to reemphasize that we often focus on Apollo 11 as the first lunar landing mission, but there were a number of missions after Apollo 11, and I'll just speak about them briefly because they're also very significant. So after Apollo 11, there was Apollo 12 in November of 1969. They did a remarkable pinpoint landing near the Surveyor 3 probe, and they did a more extensive set up a more extensive scientific package on the lunar surface, and they did 2 EVAs or moonwalks. Then there was Apollo 13. There was, unfortunately, because of an oxygen tank explosion, it was an emergency return, and they did not land on the lunar surface. So Apollo 14, which launched in January 1971, carried out the Apollo 13's mission, which had an even more extensive scientific program than Apollo 11 and 12. And I just wanted to speak briefly about some of the science and lunar activities that the astronauts undertook on the moon. So during their moonwalks, they collected a lot of lunar samples, and these are some examples of the tools that they used. In their bulky spacesuits, it's somewhat difficult to grab some moon rocks from the ground or to scoop up soil, so they had these specially designed tools in order to collect lunar material. Over the course of the entire Apollo program, over 840 pounds of lunar material was collected and brought back to Earth. And this is a creative way that an astronaut from Apollo 14 used one of the lunar tools. So if you can see the staff of these tools here, it will look really familiar to this golf club here. And so what he did, Alan Shepard, he brought the head of a golf club with him to the moon, and it fit inside the end of one of the lunar sample tools, and he was able to golf on the moon, and his golf balls are some of the things that were left on the lunar surface. They also set up the Apollo lunar surface experiment packages. The one they used for Apollo 11 was a simpler version, but each of the following Apollo missions had more extensive scientific experiments that they set up on the lunar surface. They were really important for seismology, determining whether the sort of the history of the moon, whether or not there were moonquakes, and measuring the distance of the moon more precisely from Earth. And then there were the final 3 missions, which are called the J missions. These had even more extensive scientific programs than the first Apollo missions. There are longer stays on the moon, 3 days with 3 moonwalks. And they also included the Lunar Rover, which you can see here. This is another one of the items that was left on the moon. These rovers were important because it allowed the astronauts to travel farther from the lunar module so they could collect more samples. So we have Apollo 15, that was July 1971, and then Apollo 16, 1972, and then the final lunar mission was Apollo 17 in December of 1972. And to highlight 2 items from these missions, with Apollo 16, they brought up the first telescope to observe from another planetary body this ultraviolet camera and spectrograph, which was designed by George Crothers. You can see him here, and it's gold-plated. And then on the same mission, astronaut Charlie Duke brought up a picture of his family and left it on the moon. And I wanted to end with this. I think this item in particular is a great reminder that Project Apollo, part of what made it significant, it was that it was a human spaceflight program, and items like this remind us what the human experience on exploring other bodies is like. And I'll pass it on to Michelle. Thanks for your attention.
I see a lot of familiar names in the attendees, and I want to thank everybody for coming. I hope that we can talk a lot about, we can get a lot of people thinking about preservation, but I, in particular, wanted to welcome Marlene Lozier and Derek Weber, who are on our board at For All Moonkind, our all-volunteer board, I should say, and a very special welcome and thank you to Jerry Trachtman, who's also on our board, and Ron Creel, who are both Apollo engineers. It's a real honor to have you guys here with us today. So with that, I'll just go ahead and get started. You heard about me. I'm Michelle Hanlon from For All Moonkind. I'm a space lawyer, and I'm here to talk to you about protecting human heritage in the cradle of our spacefaring civilization, and that's what I like to call the moon. So I think Teasel, you know, the Apollo program is just so mind-bogglingly awesome. And I really appreciated seeing Teasel talk about it with such, you know, somebody who really knows it. I barely scraped the surface, and I feel like I know a lot. But truly, the history of the moon, human history on the moon, started in 1959 with this Luna 2, the first human-made object to impact another celestial body. But when we think about history on the moon, I say we have to go back much, much further. When we look at human milestones, we talk about things that were critical. Sorry, we'll keep it there for now. Were critical to the stages of human development, like discovering fire, learning how to draw, and overcoming our fear of open water. These are human milestones. It's just like getting into space, another human milestone. The other sort of objects that got us to, you know, the critical stages of human development include other parts of human evolution. So this is Shango bone from the Congo, is possibly the first time humans actually talked about or did math. This glass from Mesopotamia is centuries old. These are things we could not have gotten to the moon without. This kind of heritage, this kind of human evolution is what has what got us to the moon. I get so excited I run over my own words. let's see. So you see, human history on the moon really began about 3.5 million years ago when we stood up and freed our hands. The footsteps from the last slide were in Leitoli, Tanzania. They're the first time we think that humans ever stood up on 2 feet. And that's really vital to evolution because it shows that's when we freed up our hands, that's when we were able to start creating the instruments, the math, understand the math, draw, and think about doing other things besides just surviving. We preserve those footsteps in Leitoli. We protect them. We cover them up and only open them up to view every 3 or 4 years because we understand the importance of preservation here on Earth. And nothing demonstrates that more than this picture taken in Egypt. So when Egypt recognized that it needed to dam the Nile in order to prevent the destructive floods, in order to become a more developed nation. They realized that damming it would bury these temples, the cradle, considered one of the cradles of human civilization. And so they reached out to the international community and asked for help. And the international community didn't say, oh, Egypt, that's just you, forget it, we're not worried about it. The international community recognized how important it was to preserve this. And so the international community came together in 1969, and they moved most of those temples and statues out of the path of the dam piece by piece. They raised $40 million to do that, and it became the birth of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. So we really understand the need for preservation on Earth. But let's get us back to space. I'm just gonna hope that this advances. Obviously, Apollo 11 is the best known artifact in space, the Eagle at Tranquility Base. But the Soviet Union also had 24 Luna missions, and including Luna 17, which brought Lunokhod 1, which were the first wheels on the moon. There are about 110 sites on the moon with human material on them, including Eugene Shoemaker's ashes, the first known human remains placed off Earth. And that on the other side is Chang'e 4. So China also has 2 rovers on the moon. So clearly the moon holds a bounty of cultural heritage. The sites and the artifacts are an archaeologist's dream. They confirm humans as an exploratory migratory animal, and they are frozen in time, undisturbed by wind or rain, untouched by any human or any other living organism. So this is taken from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. You can still see the astronaut's footpath. This kind of preservation is amazing. They memorialize the work of hundreds of thousands, if not more people. There's our friend Ron. 400,000 engineers and scientists in the United States, but like I said at the beginning, they memorialize the work of millions of people throughout human history who have been innovative, who have set their sights on the stars, and who have dreamed about reaching there. And that includes the scientists at Maryland's own Goddard Space Flight Center. So given all of that, you'd think these sites would be well protected. If only that were true. What we've learned when the archaeologists started looking at preserving sites on the moon, we understood there was a huge gap in international law. As a matter of first instance, nothing on the moon is registered in the United Nations registry. This is how Apollo 11 is registered at the United Nations. It's only the rocket Saturn V that's launched. And that's because under international law, we only have to register what we're launching into orbit. We don't register where it's going or what it's going to do. In the United States, we have our own registry, which lists all of the US material on the moon. But this registry is American only. It carries no international weight whatsoever. Under international law, space is governed by 4 main treaties: the Outer Space Treaty, the Liability Convention, Registration Convention, and Rescue and Return Agreement. They are all silent with respect to the preservation and protection of cultural heritage, but they do affirm that no nation may claim sovereignty over any territory in space, and that's going to become important, as we'll see. Under the Outer Space Treaty, Article 8 does say the state party on whose registry an object is launched into outer space shall retain jurisdiction and control over such objects. So clearly, what the United States, what the Soviet Union, Russia, China puts on the moon remains the property of that country. What does that mean? Article 6, I'm blanking, but there is an article, liability for damage to a space object. Entities can be liable in the event of an object damage being caused to a space object. So think about what we saw. So you know we keep these objects. This, the LEM is a United States object, but what kind of damage would somebody be liable for? This is an inoperable object. It has no recognition under international law as anything except an inoperable object. So if somebody came and knocked over the LEM or pulled that plaque, there's no liability. What is the damage? There's nothing. And moreover, does this mean the objects can't be moved at all? If we go swing the pendulum the other way and we say you can't touch it, well, if you can't touch anything that's on the moon, then there's nothing to stop any nation or entity from just putting stuff on the moon and saying, hey, liability, you can't move this. So there's a real gap that's causing a problem, not just with respect to heritage, but with respect to actual territory and doing operational things on the moon. There's Article 9 requires that people or nations on the active in outer space have to act with due regard for each other. What does due regard mean? I mean, you and me as people, we know what due regard means. It's respect and politeness and civility. But you know, lawyers get involved and it means something completely different. Due regard has only been litigated once in the international community with respect to the UN Law of the Sea. And the tribunal declined to find sort of any formal formulation. They said, rather, the extent of the regard required by the convention will depend upon the nature of the rights held by the second state, blah, blah, blah. That's a lot of lawyerese, legalese that's not going to protect our heritage on the moon. Case in point, this is how we look at our heritage on Earth. And so what is due regard? It's certainly not enough to protect Apollo or Luna or Chang'e. Article 9 also says you have to have an international consultation if you think you're going to cause harmful interference to somebody else's objects or activities. Again, that doesn't say you can't harmfully interfere. That says you have to have an international consultation before you harmfully interfere. This is especially important on the moon because if you look at this picture here, this is a picture of Surveyor, which was about 300 feet away from the landing of Apollo 12, and yet the trajectory of the plumes of the regolith on Apollo 12 when it landed caused extensive scratching and even dents to the Surveyor 3. We know this because Surveyor 3 is the first human-made object that we brought back from the moon after sending it there robotically. So there's a tremendous concern about landing even 300 feet too close to the LEM because it will cause this kind of damage and ruin and mark our cultural heritage forever. And there's also a distinction between the sites and the artifacts. So we know that the objects belong to the country that put them there. And so as a lawyer, I can make a colorable argument that if you move this picture, that you might have damaged it in some way, but the sites have no protection whatsoever. There's no way to protect those rover tracks. There's no way under current international law to protect that boot print. And we can see, you know, is this harmful interference if somebody comes and steps on Buzz Aldrin's footprint? I don't know. Under international law, we have no idea. And that's a travesty. So think about it. This is St. Clements Island, where Maryland was born. This is the first Maryland settlers landed on this island. You have a cross and you have an entire state park. This island off the shore of Maryland enjoys more recognition and more protection than the Apollo sites or the Chang'e sites or the Luna sites or anything on the moon right now. We do have, NASA has recommendations to spacefaring entities. This is a manual which asks that if you're returning to the moon, you pay attention and not get more than 2 kilometers close to Apollo 11 because we don't understand what happens with the plume effect. We don't know how far a landing or a rover going too fast will damage. And so NASA has recommended these guidelines to protect our heritage. Unfortunately, they're not law. They're not law under US law, they're not law under international law, they're just recommendation and guidelines. If you go to the moon, please do these. So what we've done at For All Moonkind is actually, a lot of people, and I'm sure this audience would say, well, what about UNESCO? UNESCO, which we talked about after the Aswan High Dam. Recall Article 2 of the Space Treaty said outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. So the UNESCO World Heritage Site, Convention, which seeks to protect sites of cultural significance, which are so exceptional as to transcend boundaries and to be of common importance for preservations and future generations of all humanity. This is exactly what the Apollo sites and other sites on the moon are. However, under UNESCO, you can only recommend a site that's within your territory to be protected. If no sovereign nation can have territory in outer space, then no sovereign nation can actually even recommend that one of these sites be protected. We have actually approached UNESCO, and UNESCO has said we have enough problems with our, figuring out boundaries here on Earth with respect to this concept of sovereignty. We don't want to have anything to do with helping you preserve things in outer space, not so much helping us preserve things in outer space, but they recognize that because of the way the UNESCO World Heritage Convention is written, it cannot help us. We cannot take it with us into outer space. So at For All Moonkind, I hope this slide is, this is why we're concerned, because we're going back. This is Chang'e 4 on the far side of the moon. China's back there now. The Artemis, the US would like to go back with humans in 2024. China's going back in 2030. The moon is going to get really crowded. So we need to find a way to protect and preserve and manage the preservation of our human heritage in outer space. So For All Moonkind is an entirely volunteer organization. This is our legal counsel. It's just an example of all the people committed to this project, and they are all volunteer. We're really proud to have them. We're lawyers, we're communicators, we're scientists, we're engineers, and we have one goal, and that's to protect our heritage, not just for the protection of heritage in general, but because we understand the universality of human activities on the moon. We, as a human species, got to the moon. This isn't a national, this is certainly an opportunity for national pride, but even much deeper, it's an opportunity for human pride. And we believe that we need to capture that universality in order to create a sustainable community in space for the future. For All Moonkind, as mentioned, is a permanent observer to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which has done a phenomenal job of keeping the peace in space, but which we have been pushing for the 2 years we've been a permanent observer to talk about heritage protection. In addition, we've worked for, sorry, I don't see a peek of my next slide, but yes. So the NASA guidelines, we thought, what can we do in the United States? The United States can't create national parks on the moon, but we can ask our own people to protect the sites, and we can make those NASA guidelines law. So we worked with Senator Cruz and Senator Peters to create the One Small Step to Protect Human Heritage in Space Act, and that would simply make the NASA guidelines binding on all US entities. The bill unanimously passed the Senate last year at this time, and it's languishing in the House. So if you have time, call your congressperson and tell them we need to pass HR 3766 because it's the first step to protecting our heritage in space. We are also very proud that protecting heritage has made it into the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords are guidelines for the US government created by NASA and the State Department to start implementing bilateral agreements as we go back to the moon, or as Jim Bronstein likes to say, go forward to the moon together. I believe this is the first time protecting heritage has ever made it into the guidelines for any kind of international agreement regarding space. And so we're really proud of our work in doing that and getting that heritage into the Artemis Accords. We've also created a registry As I mentioned, we have 110 sites on the moon that we've identified that have human material on them. We're working with TOTA, a Canadian company, to create a registry or a catalog of all those sites, and we hope to have that up and running very soon. But this is, the first step to understanding to be able to protect things. We have to understand what's up there, right? And so I think this is a really powerful tool because we'll be able to ultimately map not just tranquility base, but all of the tools that Teasel showed us that are also on the moon. We're also working on creating a manual on the protection of heritage in space. This would be a summit bringing together renowned space lawyers and renowned preservation lawyers. We're not going to tell the international community how to create a treaty, but what we can do is pave the way by identifying the issues that need to be addressed, offering resolutions along with pros and cons. The manual was to be distributed at UN Copois in June 2020. Things obviously got a little sidelined, so we're hoping for a UN Copois June 2021 release of that manual. And finally, we're working with the University of Central Florida. We talked about the plume effect and how damaging that can be. Well, one way to prevent that damage is to create international common lunar landing pads. And we're working with the University of Central Florida to raise money to research in situ resource utilization to actually get to the moon, center that regolith up there, and then have landing pads that are not going to kick up the regolith and damage our artifacts. And what's important here, and I know this is a preservation group, but we also need to talk about developing the moon. And preservation and development, they go hand in hand. They aren't at odds with each other. Having lunar landing pads will preserve our heritage. They will also preserve operational equipment on the moon. Deep pause. And so we have the Leitoli Footprint, the first time humans stood up on 2 feet and freed their hands to do things like make rockets. And we have our first human footstep off of Earth. One of these is protected, the other is not. I like to end with the quote, which will pop up in a little bit, on standing on the shoulders of giants. We truly are standing on the shoulders of giants. And we hope that you'll join us, because the last thing we want to do is erase the footsteps of those giants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We really appreciate it. So we do have some time to ask questions. I hope everyone sees their question box. If you do have any questions, just go ahead and put them in there. I was actually kind of curious, and I'm actually, give me one moment, I'm going to adjust our screen so we can see everybody. Hello. I did have one question. So you were talking about kind of creating a master list of where everything is. And so, does that include things like tracks? Is there a way to be able to kind of identify both the objects plus the tracks? Like, how exactly is that a collaboration with historians? And can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Sure, thank you. The first step is to actually find the objects. And so we are categorizing objects and sites by mission. And so when you look at the Apollo 11 mission, you don't just have the LEM, you also have where the ascent stage landed and things like that. And so when you think about Apollo, they also impacted a lot of time on purpose for scientific reasons, different parts of the moon. So that's why there's so many different sites on the moon. We are working with our archaeologists to identify, the actual site includes all of those rover tracks. I think I can, if I have any commercial industry people on the line, you can hear them taking a huge gasp of breath, because that's like a tremendous overreach from a preservation standpoint. I don't know, I'm not smart enough to know how much track we need to save and how much we don't need to save, but I want to, for All Moonkind, is creating the foundation so that we actually have that conversation before it's all erased.
So is anyone else looking to see it? And you can also raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question. Oh, we have one come in here. So this is a question: is the international community as enthusiastic as the US to establish preservation guidelines?
So it's interesting because I would say the Artemis Accords are a huge step forward, as you can see by the fact that the House bill is languishing right now. I don't think there's a huge amount of excitement for protection of heritage in space at all in the U.S. I think that we have been a steady drumbeat, and actually, you know, the attorney at the State Department basically said, you know, you're annoying enough that we decided to throw it in. It's something people don't think a lot about. You know, people don't wake up in the morning and say, oh gosh, someone's going to run over that boot print, because people don't really recognize that we're going back and so swiftly. When we talk to people, though, I will say, American or international, if I say we want to protect the boot print, nobody says that's a dumb idea. Nobody says, oh, why, that's a waste of money. Everybody says, how? How are you going to do that? We have an international community that has not had agreement on anything related to space, binding enforceable agreement, since the 1970s. How are you going to get people to agree to protect heritage? And we say 193 nations have signed and ratified the UNESCO World Heritage Convention. 193 nations understand the importance of preservation, and we believe we can get 193 nations to accept that and move that into space with us, and it would be tragic if we couldn't.
So the other question is, since it appears UNESCO has, and maybe this, you can speak if this is not a correct assumption, but it says, since it appears UNESCO has no interest in this, has any attempt been made to contact Russia and China?
We are talking. We have board members from both Russia and China on our board. Our reaction to us at the international community is very much a wait and see. When we first introduced ourselves to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, the Russian delegation was incensed in many ways. First of all, they couldn't figure out how to translate For All Moonkind into Russian, and that caused a little bit of a stir because they felt that they were being somehow disrespected. We got through that, but it's interesting because Russia has actually sold some of their heritage to a private entity, private individual, Richard Garriott. So Lunar 2 is owned by a private individual. A lot when the Soviet Union transitioned to the Russian Federation and their space program lost a lot of money, they sold a lot of their stuff to whoever would buy it, to the international community. So the Russian delegate said to me, well, it said on the floor of the committee, we should just bring that stuff back and put it in a museum here on Earth, because nobody's going to get to the moon and see it. And our response was, maybe you're not going to get to the moon, but our children are, and their children are, and we need to preserve that stuff on site, because it's very hard to recreate the stories if we erase those footsteps.
So can you explain a little bit more about the Artemis Accords, who's in it and the process behind it?
So the Artemis Accords are just a set of guidelines. NASA and the State Department introduced them as an invitation to other countries to engage in bilateral agreements. So we have an agreement right now. It's called an intergovernmental agreement, and that governs international relations on the International Space Station. And so the intergovernmental agreement actually fills in some of those gaps that we have in outer space law. And one thing we recognize about going to the moon, and the U.S. is very intent on resource mining, so utilizing space resources. In addition to protecting heritage, utilizing space resources falls within one of those gaps in the international law. And so the United States has said, look, we want to go forward to the moon together. These are the principles that we would expect any of our partners to abide by. And when you look at the general principles, they pretty much follow the Outer Space Agreement, peaceful uses, collaboration, transparency, and so forth. That's all we know about the Artemis Accords right now, that these are a set of aspirational goals that as a bottom line, the US will not negotiate with anybody who doesn't agree to those general principles. But right now, the US and NASA, the US is negotiating with partners like Japan and Europe, and sort of bringing out the details of those agreements. So they're not, the Artemis Accords are not agreements, they're just general principles. And there has been a lot of controversy. You know, if you've read the news, Russia has said we're not going to join the discussion. We're going to go work with China instead. You know, it's sadly, the truth is we have not had a binding enforceable agreement on space law since the 1970s. And if we have to start working bilaterally, and if that's what it takes to jumpstart a multilateral agreement, and it just might. I know that there are a lot of organizations right now urging the United Nations to take this specific topic under their wing and address it. And so whether or not these bilateral agreements are negotiated, are later superseded by multilateral agreements, the bottom line is finally we're jumpstarting a conversation on space resource utilization. And thankfully and proudly, heritage is a part of that conversation.
So another question came in about how it's decided that artifacts from the moon come to the Earth. So how does that, and this might be for you, Teasel, or for you, Michelle, you know, you'd mentioned that some stuff did come back and you were able to look at that. How is that process decided? But, you know, anything from Earth rocks and where those end up to some of the artifacts that are left behind.
So one of the important factors with space exploration is that weight means that you need more fuel. And so the astronauts left as much as they could on the moon. They didn't bring it back with them. And so those pictures of tools and things like that, they left on the moon, and they only brought a handful of items back to Earth. So lunar samples were really important for scientific exploration, but there wasn't that much in addition to that that was brought back. We were really, really excited. The Smithsonian was really excited a few years ago because Neil Armstrong's widow discovered this pack full of artifacts that we had thought had been left on the moon, which included a camera that recorded the first steps from the window of the lunar module. And so that's a wonderful special material that we had assumed would have been left on the moon for weight reasons, but was brought back. So a lot of it does come down to weight.
I just like to add, I don't know if your the audience knows it, but some things actually don't make it back to the Smithsonian. So when we first formed, there was the first moon bag carried by the first man with the first lunar material was sold at Sotheby's because it came into the hands of a private individual totally legally, but you know, sort of slipped through the hands of NASA. And so one thing we say is that bag sold for $2.4 million, and the person who sold it, the private individual, actually sued NASA because she believes that NASA removed some of the lunar dust from it, making it less valuable when they looked at it to certify that it was actually the first moon bag. So the issue is twofold. First of all, you know, if NASA had lost this bag at a time when we only had like 1 or 2 missions to the moon a year, think about what's going to happen when we have a lot of people going back and forth. I mean, Jeff Bezos is talking about having a delivery service. And secondly, $2.4 million. You know, you go back to the Tranquility Base and you grab anything and bring it back to Earth as a private individual, you can make a lot of money. And so we really need to protect these artifacts, hopefully in situ.
So another question, with the growing excitement around future Artemis missions, do you think this will help the cause for preservation on the moon?
I think so. And I'll let Teasel answer as well, but you know, the more people recognize and remember what we've done on the moon, you know, I still talk to audiences that don't believe we put humans on the moon. And it's just about education and getting this more. I think NASA's trying very hard to popularize. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have caught the imagination. Unfortunately, you know, when you talk about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, they're billionaires. And so people think, oh, space is for billionaires. And that's not true. Space is for everyone. Anybody can get involved in space. There's so many different paths. I'm a lawyer and I'm involved in space. So I believe any kind of attention we can bring to the moon will bring attention to preservation.
I agree.
So,
The upcoming missions are getting people very excited about returning to the moon, and then this question of the preserving the sites will come up again. I'm often asked, what do I think, and would I like it if the some of the artifacts from these sites came back to Earth and we could put them in the Smithsonian? And I would prefer that they were left in place and those sites were preserved. But it's a question I get asked quite often, actually.
So we have a couple more in. One is kind of interesting to me. It's, what do you think the next major heritage site will be on the moon?
The next major heritage site in outer space, what will it be?
It said on the moon in the question, but if you have one in outer space, that would work too.
So, yeah, do you want to take it first? And
I'll hand it over to you.
so it's interesting because we're really struggling with, my collaborator Marlene is on the call, I think. We're really struggling with what is an artifact. How are we going to identify what needs to be protected? And one thing, you know, that you have this idea that every national first ought to be protected. But if you go down that path, then that you're talking about 193 different sites that need to be protected because it's the first time this, and the first time Ghana, and the first time Colombia. So I think that this return to the moon, whoever gets back there first is going to be probably the next big site that should be protected, because I believe that this gulf, this window between 1972 and whenever we get back, shows just how ridiculously impossible Apollo was. Like, the fact that we haven't repeated it in 50 years, I think is just remarkable. And so when we repeat it, whether it's American or Chinese or Russian or hopefully some phenomenal collaboration, that should be preserved, because that will show, okay, we went there, we created our cradle for our spacefaring civilization, and then we stumbled a bit, but now we're back.
Mm-hmm. So another question, just kind of, I think we kind of talked about a little bit with the talk about the bag and these things, but does this issue go in the other direction? Do the rocks from the moon really belong to the government, or do they belong, you know, what kind of ownership issues come up with some of the stuff that does come back?
So I can speak to from the Apollo program. The Smithsonian has a relationship with NASA and has since the mid-1960s, and so we're able to preserve and share a lot of those artifacts with the public, and then we also have a huge amount of Apollo-related artifacts on loan to other museums around the country and around the world. The lunar material, though, is controlled by NASA, except for a handful of specimens that were given as gifts, like in the plaques that I showed. But NASA has made those samples available for scientific research, both domestically and internationally, for the past 50 years. And they're still being requested and used by scientists to learn even more about the moon. Unfortunately, NASA had the foresight to realize that scientific instruments would improve over time. So some of that material was preserved so that it would only be investigated today, when our instruments have improved since the 1970s. So that's I guess, a short answer. Michelle, do you have anything you'd like to add?
From a legal standpoint, you know, this concept of ownership, of course, is just, you know, untouchable. You know, when we talk about resource utilization, whether in space or bringing it back to Earth, one of the debates in the international community right now is, you know, the Outer Space Treaty says no state may claim sovereignty. So is that just to the territory? Can a state bring stuff back and use it on Earth? Can a state utilize the resources without claiming territory? And of course, lawyers who believe that they should be able to point to the fact that the US and the Soviet Union have brought samples back and have kept them and claimed ownership to them. So the idea is, under customary international law now, because nobody objected to that, if you extract something, whether it's a rock or helium, you can bring it back and you can own that resource, even though you can't own the territory from whence it came. And I know that there's a lot of international lawyers who are going to squabble with me on that one, but that's my belief.
Well, we have so many questions, but we are at time. So I want to get one last one that I think is a great place to stop, which is how do we get involved with For All Moonkind?
Thank you. You go to our website, forallmoonkind.org. You can email me personally, Michelle at forallmoonkind.org, and we can talk about how you can contribute. We need volunteers at all levels, coders, lawyers, communicators, brochures, t-shirts. Buy a t-shirt, tell your friends. Teasel, I hope that when people ask you about whether we need to preserve things, you tell them about us as well. We just got to get the word out there, and I think, and of course, call your congressperson. Let's get that bill passed through the House.
Well, thank you both so much for coming. We really appreciate your time, and this has been really fascinating and a great way to spend the 51st anniversary of the moon landing.